Tycoon abandoned his pregnant wife. Years later finds out she's raising his son. This is it. Richard, he whispered to himself, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Today's the day you make your mark. The elevator dinged, and Richard stepped out onto the 30th floor, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. He was early as usual. At 28, he was the youngest executive in the company's history, and he was determined to prove that he deserved his position. As he walked into the conference room, Richard's phone buzzed. It was a text from Emma, his wife. "Good luck today, honey. Remember, we have the ultrasound appointment at 4. Can't wait to see our little one. Love you." Richard's fingers hovered over the screen, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. He had completely forgotten about the appointment. For a moment, he considered rescheduling the meeting he had planned for that afternoon. But then he remembered the potential client he was meeting, a deal that could skyrocket his career. "I'm sorry, Em," he muttered, quickly typing a response. "Something came up at work. Can we reschedule? I promise I'll make it up to you." He hit send and turned off his phone, pushing thoughts of Emma and their unborn child to the back of his mind. There would be other ultrasounds, other moments. Right now, he had an empire to build. As the room began to fill with colleagues and clients, Richard plastered on his signature charming smile. He was in his element here among spreadsheets and profit margins. This was where he truly came alive. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonating with confidence. "Today, we're not just discussing numbers. We're talking about the future, your future, my future, the future of this company." As Richard launched into his presentation, he felt a surge of adrenaline. This was what he was born to do. In that moment, he couldn't imagine being anywhere else, not even in a dimly lit doctor's office, holding Emma's hand as they caught the first glimpse of their child. Little did Richard know that this day, this choice, would set in motion a series of events that would change the course of his life forever. For now, though, he was riding high on the wave of ambition, blind to the storm that was brewing on the horizon. Emma took a deep breath, trying to quell the rising tide of disappointment and frustration. This wasn't the first time Richard had canceled on her, but it stung more than usual today. She had been looking forward to sharing this moment with him, to seeing his face light up at the sight of their baby on the ultrasound screen. "It's okay, little one," she murmured, caressing her belly. "Daddy's just busy. He'll be here next time." But even as she spoke the words, a part of Emma wondered if she truly believed them. She walked over to the refrigerator, covered in sticky notes and reminders of doctor's appointments, most of which she had attended alone. Her fingers traced the edge of a photo tucked under a magnet. It was from their wedding day just a year ago. Richard's arms were wrapped around her, both of their faces radiant with joy and promise. Where had that man gone? The sharp ring of the doorbell jolted Emma from her reverie. She opened the door to find her best friend, Sarah, standing there with a sympathetic smile. "He canceled again, didn't he?" Sarah asked, pulling Emma into a warm hug. Emma nodded, unable to speak as the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. "Oh, honey," Sarah soothed, guiding Emma to the couch. "You know what? Forget him. I'll come with you to the appointment. That baby deserves to have someone there who's excited to see them." Emma managed a watery smile. "Thanks, Sarah. I don't know what I'd do without you." As they left the apartment, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was shifting in her life. She loved Richard. She truly did. But as she placed her hand protectively over her unborn child, she realized that maybe love wasn't enough. "I'll always be here for you," she whispered to her baby, a newfound determination stealing her voice. No matter what, little did Emma know that this moment of strength, born from disappointment and nurtured by friendship, would be the first step on a long and challenging journey. As she walked towards the elevator, her head held high despite the ache in her heart. The future stretched out before her, uncertain, but full of possibilities. "Would you like to know the gender?" the doctor asked, smiling kindly at Emma. Emma hesitated, her joy tinged with a bittersweet ache. This was a moment she had dreamed of sharing with Richard. She swallowed hard, pushing down the lump in her throat. "Yes," she said finally. Yes, I would. Congratulations. It's a boy. A boy. She was having a son. Tears of joy streamed down Emma's face as she imagined a little boy with Richard's eyes and her smile. But the happiness was short-lived as reality came crashing back. Later that evening, Emma sat on the edge of their bed, the ultrasound picture clutched in her trembling hands. She heard the front door open and close, followed by Richard's footsteps. "Em, you home?" his voice called out. Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. "In here," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and a triumphant smile on his face. "You won't believe the day I've had. We closed the deal, Em. This is huge for my career." His excitement faded as he took in Emma's tear-stained face and the picture in her hands. "Oh God, the appointment. Emma, I'm so sorry. It's a boy," Emma interrupted, her voice trembling with a mixture of joy and anger. "We're having a son, Richard. And you missed it." Richard's face fell, the weight of his mistake finally hitting him. He moved to sit beside her, reaching for the ultrasound picture. But Emma pulled away, standing up abruptly. "No, Richard, this isn't just about today. It's about every day. Every appointment you've missed, every night you've stayed late at the office. I feel like I'm doing this alone." Richard's brow furrowed, a flicker of defensiveness crossing his face. "I'm working hard for us, for our future. Can't you see that? Our future." Emma's voice rose, years of pent-up frustration finally boiling over. "What about our present, Richard? What about our son? He needs a father who's present, not just financially providing." "That's not fair," Richard shot back, standing up as well. "Everything I do for this family. Do you?" Emma challenged, her eyes blazing. "Or do you do it for yourself? For your ambition?" The silence that followed was deafening. They stood there, two people who had promised to love each other forever, suddenly feeling worlds apart. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice low and controlled. "I have a chance to expand the business overseas. It would mean relocating for a while." Emma felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. For how long? A year, maybe two. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Emma clutched the ultrasound picture to her chest, feeling as though she might shatter into a million pieces. "And what about us? What about your son?" Richard ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Emma. Can't you understand that?" In that moment, looking into Richard's eyes, Emma saw their future unfold. A future of missed milestones, of loneliness, of a child growing up wondering why he wasn't enough for his father. And she knew, with a clarity that both terrified and strengthened her, that she couldn't live that life. "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The question is, Richard, do you understand what you're giving up?" As they stood there, the ultrasound picture between them like a silent accusation, the air crackled with unspoken words and life-altering decisions. The future hung in the balance, waiting to see which way it would tip. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, willing him to look up, to change his mind, to choose them. But Richard's gaze remained fixed ahead as he climbed into the taxi. As the car pulled away, Emma felt a kick from within her swollen belly. She placed her hand there, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. "It's just you and me now, little one," she whispered. The sound of the doorbell jolted her from her thoughts. For a split second, hope flared in her chest. Had Richard changed his mind? But when she opened the door, it was Sarah standing there, concern etched on her face. "Oh, Emma," Sarah breathed, pulling her friend into a tight embrace. Emma broke down then, tears she had been holding back for weeks finally spilling over. "He's gone, Sarah. He really left us." Sarah guided Emma to the couch, her arm protectively around her friend's shoulders. "I can't believe he would do this. To you, to his child." Emma wiped her eyes, trying to regain composure. He said this was his chance. That he was doing it for us." She let out a bitter laugh. "As if abandoning your pregnant wife is ever for the benefit of your family." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. That's bullshit and you know it. He's doing this for himself, Emma. Pure and simple. Emma nodded, her hand absently stroking her belly. I know. I think I've always known. I never thought he'd actually leave. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Richard's decision hanging heavy in the air. Then, Emma straightened her shoulders, a newfound determination in her eyes. I need to be strong now, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. For my son. He deserves better than a father who could walk away so easily. Sarah squeezed her hand. You're not alone in this, Emma. I'm here, and so are your parents, and all your friends. We'll help you through this. Emma managed a small smile, grateful for the support. But as she looked around the apartment, at the spaces where Richard's things used to be, she couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. Later that night, as Emma lay in bed, her hand resting on her belly, she felt a flutter of movement. Hello, little one, she whispered. I want you to know something. No matter what happens, no matter how hard things get, I will never leave you. You are my priority, my world, my everything. And I promise you we're going to be okay. As she spoke those words into the quiet darkness, Emma felt a shift within herself. The pain was still there, raw and aching, but alongside it was a steely resolve. Richard may have walked away, but she would stand strong. For herself and for the little life growing inside her. Outside, the city hummed with life, oblivious to the small drama unfolding in one apartment. And as Emma drifted off to sleep, her dreams were filled with images of a future she had yet to imagine. One where she was both mother and father, protector and provider, her son's whole world. The journey ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles she couldn't yet foresee. But in that moment, cradling her unborn child, Emma found a strength she never knew she possessed. The strength to face whatever came next, alone but unbroken. Hello, Lucas, she whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. I'm your mommy. Sarah stood by the bedside, her eyes brimming with tears of happiness. He's perfect, Emma. Absolutely perfect. Emma couldn't take her eyes off her son's tiny face. His eyes, still unfocused, seemed to search for hers. She marveled at his tiny fingers, his button nose, the soft wisps of dark hair that hinted at Richard's features. Richard. The name brought a pang of sadness to her heart. He should be here sharing this moment. But the chair beside her bed remained empty, a stark reminder of his absence. As if sensing her thoughts, Sarah gently squeezed Emma's shoulder. You did this, Em, all on your own. You're amazing. Emma managed a small smile, but her voice wavered as she spoke. I wish he could see his son. The door to the room opened, and a nurse entered with a clipboard. Ms. Lawson, we need to fill out the birth certificate. Father's name. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Emma looked down at Lucas, then back up at the nurse. Her voice was quiet but firm as she replied, There's no father. It's just us. The nurse nodded sympathetically, making a note on the form. As she left the room, Emma felt a mix of emotions wash over her: sadness, anger, but also a fierce determination. It's okay, Lucas, she murmured to her son. We don't need anyone else. Mommy's got you. Days passed, and Emma found herself navigating the challenging waters of new motherhood. Sleepless nights blended into exhausting days. There were moments of pure joy: Lucas's first smile, the way he gripped her finger with his tiny hand. But there were also moments of overwhelming loneliness and doubt. One particularly difficult night, as Lucas wailed inconsolably at 3 a.m., Emma felt her resolve crumbling. She paced the nursery, gently bouncing Lucas in her arms, tears streaming down her face. Please, baby, she pleaded. Please stop crying. Mommy doesn't know what to do. In that moment of desperation, she found herself reaching for her phone, Richard's number still saved in her contacts. Her finger hovered over the call button. Would he answer? Would he care? But as she looked down at Lucas, his cries starting to subside as he nestled against her chest, Emma felt a surge of strength. She put the phone down, untouched. We can do this, she whispered, as much to herself as to Lucas. We don't need him. We're strong together, you and me." As the sun began to rise, painting the nursery in soft hues of pink and gold, Emma settled into the rocking chair with Lucas. He had finally fallen asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. "I promise you, my love," Emma said softly, her voice filled with determination, "I will give you the best life I can. You'll never doubt that you're loved, never wonder if you're enough. We may not have everything, but we'll have each other. And that's more than enough." As she sat there, watching the new day dawn, Emma felt a glimmer of hope for the future. The road ahead would be challenging, but looking at her son's peaceful face, she knew it would be worth every struggle. Little did Emma know that across the ocean, Richard was embarking on his own journey, one that would eventually lead him back to the family he had left behind. But for now, in that quiet moment of early morning, it was just Emma and Lucas, facing the world together. "Mr. Montgomery," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The board is ready for you." Richard straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and strode towards the conference room. As he pushed open the heavy wooden doors, a hush fell over the room. The faces of the board members, a mix of admiration, fear, and anticipation, greeted him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd cultivated over the years. "Today marks a pivotal moment for Montgomery Industries. Our expansion into the Asian market has exceeded all projections." As he delivered his presentation, Richard felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with corporate success. Graphs showed skyrocketing profits, plans detailed aggressive expansion strategies, and the board members nodded approvingly. Yet, as the meeting concluded and handshakes were exchanged, Richard felt a hollowness that had become all too familiar. He retreated to his office, loosening his tie as he sank into his leather chair. "Another successful quarter, sir," his assistant said, placing a stack of reports on his desk. "Shall I arrange for the usual celebration?" Richard waved her off. "No, not tonight. I think I'll just head home." Home. The word felt strange on his tongue. His luxurious apartment, with its minimalist decor and panoramic views, had never truly felt like home. As he rode the elevator down to the parking garage, Richard's mind wandered, as it often did in quiet moments, to the life he'd left behind. Emma's face, frozen in hurt and disbelief, flashed before his eyes. And the child, his child, whom he'd never met. In the solitude of his car, Richard allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. He pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over Emma's name in his contacts. He'd never had the courage to delete it, but, as always, he couldn't bring himself to make the call. What would he say? How could he possibly explain or justify his actions? As he drove through the bustling streets of Shanghai, Richard's mind raced. He had everything he'd ever wanted: wealth, power, success. So why did he feel so empty? Arriving at his apartment, Richard poured himself a drink and walked out onto the balcony. The city sprawled before him, a testament to his professional achievements. But as he gazed at the millions of twinkling lights, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd lost something far more valuable than anything he'd gained. "I wonder what he looks like now," Richard murmured, thinking of the son he'd never known. "Does he have my eyes? Emma's smile?" The questions hung in the air, unanswered. Richard took a long sip of his drink, the alcohol burning a path down his throat. He'd built an empire, but at what cost? As the night wore on, Richard made a decision. It was time to go back, to face the consequences of his choices, to see what remained of the life he'd left behind. He didn't know what he'd find, or if there was any chance of redemption, but he knew he had to try. Little did Richard know that his decision would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, family, and the true meaning of wealth. As he began to make plans for his return, fate was already weaving its intricate web, preparing to bring him face to face with the son he'd abandoned and the woman he'd never truly forgotten. As he stepped off the plane, Richard's assistant, Claire, hurried to his side. "Mr. Montgomery, your schedule for the week is set." The real estate agent will meet you at the penthouse in an hour to discuss potential office locations. Richard nodded absently, his eyes scanning the horizon. Thank you, Claire. But first, I need you to find out something for me. Claire looked up from her tablet, curiosity piquing her interest. Of course, sir. What do you need? Richard hesitated, the words feeling strange on his tongue. I need you to locate Emma Lawson. And our son. Claire's eyes widened slightly, but she maintained her professional composure. Certainly, sir. I'll get right on it. As the sleek black car wound its way through the bustling streets, Richard found himself lost in thought. The city had changed, new skyscrapers piercing the sky, but beneath the surface, he could still feel the pulse of the place where his journey had begun. The car pulled up to a luxurious high-rise, and Richard stepped out, adjusting his tie. He'd barely set foot in the lobby when a chipper voice called out to him. Mr. Montgomery, welcome back to New York. The real estate agent, a petite woman with a bright smile, extended her hand. I'm Samantha. I have some excellent properties lined up for your new headquarters. Richard shook her hand, forcing a smile. Lead the way, Samantha. As they toured various sleek, modern office spaces, Richard found his mind wandering. He nodded at appropriate intervals, made non-committal sounds of approval, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on a small apartment across town, on a family he'd left behind. And this one, Samantha was saying, gesturing grandly, has a stunning view of Central Park, perfect for impressing clients and partners. Richard walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the expanse of green amidst the concrete jungle. Suddenly, he felt overwhelmed by a wave of emotion. I'll take it, he said abruptly, cutting off Samantha's pitch. She blinked in surprise. But sir, we haven't even discussed the other options or... This one will do, Richard insisted, his tone brooking no argument. Have the paperwork drawn up. As Samantha scurried off to make arrangements, Richard's phone buzzed. It was a message from Claire, information located on Emma Lawson and son, Lucas. They still reside in New York. Emma runs a small bookstore in Brooklyn. Lucas, age 10, attends PS 321. Richard's breath caught in his throat. Lucas. His son had a name, a life, a world that had been spinning without him for a decade. The reality of what he'd missed hit him like a physical blow. Impulsively, he texted back, "Send me the address of the bookstore." As he waited for Claire's response, Richard stared out at the park below. Families strolled along the paths, children laughed on playgrounds, scenes of a life he'd walked away from. His phone buzzed again with the address, and before he could second-guess himself, Richard was heading for the elevator. Mr. Montgomery? Samantha called after him. Where are you going? We have more properties to see. But Richard was already gone, his mind focused on one thing, finding the family he'd abandoned. As the elevator descended, his heart pounded in his chest. He had no plan, no idea what he would say or do when he saw Emma again. All he knew was that he had to try, had to see for himself the life that had continued in his absence. As he stepped out onto the busy New York street, hailing a taxi with a practiced ease that belied his years away, Richard felt like he was standing on the precipice of something monumental. The taxi sped through the city, carrying him towards a confrontation with his past, and a future he couldn't begin to imagine. Little did he know that fate had more surprises in store, and that his carefully constructed world was about to be turned upside down in ways he never could have anticipated. As he approached the store, Richard's courage faltered. What right did he have to barge back into their lives after all this time? He turned, ready to flee, when the door chimed open behind him. "Can I help you, sir?" A young voice called out. Richard froze, then slowly turned around. There, standing in the doorway, was a boy of about 10. His dark hair fell across his forehead in a familiar way, and his eyes, Richard's breath caught in his throat. They were his own eyes staring back at him. I was just looking," Richard stammered, unable to tear his gaze away from the boy who could only be his son. The boy tilted his head, curiosity evident in his expression. "Well, we're about to close. but you can come in for a quick look if you'd like. Mom's just finishing up with a customer. Mom, Emma. She was here just inside. Richard's pulse quickened. That would be great. Thank you, he managed, following the boy into the store. The interior was warm and inviting, shelves crammed with books and odd trinkets. It smelled of old paper and cinnamon, a comforting scent that immediately put Richard at ease. I'm Lucas, by the way, the boy said, extending his hand in a surprisingly mature gesture. Richard shook it, marveling at the small hand in his. Nice to meet you, Lucas. Richard. Are you looking for anything in particular? Richard? Lucas asked, leading him deeper into the store. Before Richard could answer, a familiar voice called out from the back. Lucas, honey, can you help me with these boxes? Emma appeared from behind a bookshelf, her arms full of books. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw Richard, her face draining of color. Richard, she whispered, the books tumbling from her arms. Lucas looked between them, confusion etched on his young face. Mom, do you know this man? The air in the bookstore seemed to thicken, tension crackling like electricity. Emma's eyes, wide with shock and a hint of fear, never left Richard's face. Lucas, sweetie, she said, her voice strained, why don't you go upstairs and start your homework? I need to talk to this gentleman. Lucas hesitated, clearly sensing the gravity of the situation. But Mom, please, Lucas, Emma insisted, finally tearing her gaze away from Richard to give her son a reassuring smile. Everything's fine. I'll be up soon. As Lucas reluctantly climbed the stairs at the back of the store, Emma turned back to Richard. Her shock had given way to anger, her eyes flashing with a decade's worth of hurt and resentment. What are you doing here, Richard? She demanded, her voice low and trembling. Richard took a step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Emma, I came back. I needed to see you, to see him. Emma's laugh was bitter. After 10 years? You think you can just walk back into our lives like nothing happened? No, I know I can't, Richard said, his voice breaking. But I had to try. I've made so many mistakes, Emma. I want to make things right. Emma's eyes filled with tears, a mix of anger and old pain. Make things right? Do you have any idea what we've been through? What I've been through? As they stood there, surrounded by books and memories, the weight of the past decade hung heavy between them. Richard knew he had no right to ask for forgiveness, no right to expect anything. But looking at Emma, seeing the strength and fire in her eyes, he felt a glimmer of hope. Upstairs, unbeknownst to either of them, Lucas sat at the top of the stairs, listening intently. His young mind raced, putting together pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed until this moment. The scene in the bookstore was set for a confrontation years in the making, with the potential to change all of their lives forever. As Emma and Richard faced each other, neither knew what the next moments would bring, but both felt the tremors of a seismic shift in their carefully constructed worlds. You need to leave, Richard, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You can't just waltz back into our lives after all this time. Richard took a step forward, his eyes pleading. Emma, please. I know I have no right to be here, but I needed to see him, to see you both. Emma's eyes flashed with anger. You needed? What about what we needed, Richard? What about the nights I spent alone, wondering how I was going to raise our son by myself? Richard flinched at her words, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I was young and scared, and, God, Emma, I made such a terrible mistake. For a moment, Emma's resolve wavered. She could see the pain and regret etched on Richard's face, could hear the sincerity in his voice. But then she thought of Lucas, of all the milestones Richard had missed, and her heart hardened once more. A mistake, she scoffed. A mistake is forgetting to buy milk. You abandoned your family, Richard. You missed his first steps, his first words. You weren't there when he had nightmares or when he started school. Those aren't mistakes. Those are choices. Richard's shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. He knew she was right. Every accusation was a dagger to his heart. reminding him of all he had thrown away. "You're right," he said softly. "I don't deserve forgiveness. But I'm here now, and I want to make amends. Not just for me, but for Lucas. He deserves to know his father." At the mention of Lucas's name, Emma's protective instincts flared. "Lucas has been just fine without you. He's smart, kind, and brave. Everything he became without your help." As they argued, neither noticed the small figure that had crept halfway down the stairs. Lucas sat on a step, his young mind racing as he pieced together the fragments of conversation. "Mom," Lucas called out, his voice small but clear in the charged atmosphere of the bookstore. Emma and Richard both turned, startled. Emma's face paled as she realized her son had overheard their conversation. "Lucas, honey, I told you to stay upstairs," Emma said, trying to keep her voice calm. But Lucas's eyes were fixed on Richard, a mixture of confusion and dawning realization in his gaze. Is he my dad?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The world seemed to stand still for a moment. Emma looked torn between protecting her son and acknowledging the truth. Richard stood frozen, face to face with the child he had never known. Finally, Emma nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes, Lucas, this is your father." Lucas slowly descended the remaining stairs, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. As he approached, Richard could see traces of himself in the boy's features. The shape of his eyes, the set of his jaw. It was like looking at a ghost of his younger self. "Why did you leave us?" Lucas asked, his voice small but filled with a decade's worth of questions. Richard felt his heart breaking all over again. He knelt down to Lucas's level, fighting back tears. "I made a huge mistake, Lucas. The biggest mistake of my life. And I'm so sorry." As Lucas stood there, looking at the father he had never known, the air in the bookstore crackled with emotion. Emma watched, her heart torn between protecting her son and allowing him this moment of discovery. The scene was set for a pivotal moment that would shape all of their futures. Would Lucas accept Richard's apology? Would Emma allow Richard back into their lives? And could Richard truly make amends for a decade of absence? As the three of them stood there, surrounded by books that held countless stories, their own story hung in the balance, waiting to be written. Lucas took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. Did you ever think about us?" he asked, his voice small but steady. Richard's heart clenched at the question. "Every day," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought about you both every single day." Emma couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. "Thinking isn't the same as being here, Richard." Lucas turned to his mother, his brow furrowed. "Mom, did you know he was coming?" Emma shook her head, her eyes softening as she looked at her son. "No, honey, this is a surprise for me too." Richard stood up slowly, his gaze moving between Emma and Lucas. "I know I have no right to ask this, but could we talk properly? There's so much I want to explain, to apologize for." Emma hesitated, her protective instincts warring with the part of her that had always wondered, what if? She looked down at Lucas, who was watching the exchange with wide, uncertain eyes. "What do you think, Lucas?" she asked gently. "It's your decision too." Lucas bit his lip, looking between his mother and the father he'd just met. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly. I think I'd like to know more." Emma sighed, running a hand through her hair. "All right," she said finally. "We can talk. But not here, not now. This isn't the time or place for this conversation." Richard nodded eagerly, relief washing over his features. "Of course, whatever you're comfortable with. I'm staying at the Riverside Hotel. We could meet somewhere neutral, maybe a park or a cafe." Emma considered for a moment, then nodded. "The coffee shop on Maple Street, tomorrow at 2 p.m. It's Lucas's favorite place for hot chocolate." A small smile tugged at Lucas's lips at the mention of his favorite treat, and for a brief moment, the tension in the room eased. As Richard prepared to leave, he paused at the door, turning back to face Emma and Lucas. "Thank you," he said softly, "for giving me a chance to explain. I know I don't deserve it, Emma's expression remained guarded, but she nodded. "We'll see you tomorrow, Richard." As the bell above the door chimed, signaling Richard's departure, Emma knelt down beside Lucas, pulling him into a tight hug. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Lucas nodded against her shoulder. "I think so, Mom. It's just a lot to take in." Emma pulled back, cupping her son's face in her hands. "You know that no matter what happens, you're the most important thing in the world to me, right? Nothing will ever change that." Lucas managed a small smile. "I know, Mom. I love you too." As they closed up the bookstore that evening, the air was thick with unspoken questions and swirling emotions. Emma's mind raced with memories of the past and uncertainties about the future. Lucas, for his part, was lost in thoughts of the father he'd always wondered about but never truly known. Neither of them could have predicted the turn their lives had taken that day. As they climbed the stairs to their apartment above the bookstore, both Emma and Lucas felt the weight of tomorrow's meeting hanging over them. What would Richard say? Could he ever truly make amends for his absence? And how would this sudden reappearance affect the tight-knit family unit that Emma and Lucas had built together? As night fell over Brooklyn, 3 hearts beat with anticipation, fear, and a glimmer of hope for what the new day might bring. At precisely 2 p.m., the bell jingled, and Emma walked in with Lucas by her side. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he took in the sight of them, his family, yet strangers at the same time. Emma's eyes scanned the room, landing on Richard. She gave a curt nod and guided Lucas to the table. As they sat down, an awkward silence fell over the trio. "Hi," Lucas said softly, breaking the tension. I like your tie." Richard glanced down at his blue silk tie, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you, Lucas. It's nice to see you again." Emma cleared her throat, her posture stiff. "So, Richard, you wanted to talk." "Talk." Richard took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "I know that nothing I say can make up for the past 10 years. But I want you both to know how deeply sorry I am for leaving. It was the biggest mistake of my life." Emma's eyes flashed with a mix of pain and anger. "Why now, Richard? Why come back after all this time?" Richard's gaze dropped to his hands. "I've spent years building an empire, thinking it would fill the void in my life. But it didn't. Every success felt hollow because I knew what I'd given up to achieve it." Lucas leaned forward, his young face etched with curiosity and confusion. Did you not want me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and painful. Emma instinctively reached for her son's hand, while Richard looked as if he'd been physically struck. "No, Lucas, no," Richard said, his voice choked with emotion. "I was young and scared. I thought I wasn't ready to be a father. But I was wrong. So terribly wrong." Emma's grip on Lucas's hand tightened. "You weren't the only one who was young and scared, Richard. But I stayed. I faced it." Richard nodded, shame evident in his features. "You're right. You've been incredibly strong. Both of you. I can see that Lucas has grown into an amazing young man. And that's all because of you, Emma." Lucas looked between his parents, conflict clear in his eyes. "So what happens now? Are you staying?" The question caught Richard off guard. He looked at Emma, seeking guidance, but her face remained impassive. I'd like to, if you'll have me," Richard said cautiously. "Not to disrupt your lives, but to be a part of them. To get to know you, Lucas, and to make amends." Emma's jaw tightened. "It's not that simple, Richard. You can't just walk back in and expect everything to be okay." "I know," Richard said quickly. "I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, whatever you think is best. I don't want to miss any more of Lucas's life. Or yours, Emma." As the words hung in the air, a waiter approached with Lucas's hot chocolate. The moment of interruption gave them all a chance to breathe, to process the weight of the conversation. Lucas wrapped his hands around the warm mug, his eyes darting between his parents. "Mom," he said softly, "what do you think?" Emma closed her eyes for a moment, years of hurt and loneliness battling with the undeniable fact that Lucas deserved to know his father. When she opened them, her gaze was resolute. "We'll take it slow," she said finally. "Very slow. Lucas's well-being comes first, always." Richard nodded eagerly. "Of course. Absolutely. I'll follow your lead, Emma." As Lucas sipped his hot chocolate, a small smile playing on his lips, the atmosphere in the coffee shop shifted. The air was still charged with unresolved emotions and unanswered questions. But there was also a glimmer of possibility. None of them knew what the future held, how this delicate new dynamic would play out. But as they sat there, a family fractured but not broken, taking the first tentative steps towards reconciliation. One thing was clear: their lives would never be the same again. One crisp autumn afternoon, Richard stood outside Lucas's school, his heart pounding as he waited for the dismissal bell. Emma had reluctantly agreed to let him pick Lucas up, a small step towards normalcy that felt monumental to Richard. The sound of children's laughter filled the air as the doors burst open. Richard scanned the sea of young faces, his breath catching when he spotted Lucas making his way down the steps. "Hey, buddy," Richard called out, waving awkwardly. Lucas's face lit up with a mixture of surprise and excitement. "Richard, you really came." As Lucas approached, Richard felt a surge of emotion. This was his son, flesh and blood, yet still so unfamiliar. "Of course I did," Richard replied, smiling. "I promised, didn't I?" They began walking towards the park, an agreed-upon neutral ground for their afternoons together. Lucas chattered about his day, his words tumbling out in a rush of enthusiasm that both warmed and pained Richard's heart. How many stories had he missed over the years? "And then in science class we learned about DNA," Lucas was saying. "Did you know that's why I have your eyes?" Richard stumbled slightly, caught off guard by the casual observation. Yes, that's right. DNA is pretty amazing, isn't it?" Lucas nodded vigorously. "Mom says I have your smile too, but I'm not sure. Do you think I do?" Richard swallowed hard, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Why don't you give me a big smile and we'll see?" Lucas beamed up at him, and Richard felt his heart constrict. It was like looking in a mirror, seeing his own boyhood reflected back at him. "You know what? Your mom's right," Richard said softly. "You definitely have my smile." They reached the park, settling on a bench near the playground. An awkward silence fell between them, the weight of unasked questions hanging in the air. Finally, Lucas spoke, his voice small but determined. "Richard, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Lucas. Anything." Lucas took a deep breath. Why didn't you want us? Was it because of me?" The question hit Richard like a physical blow. He turned to face Lucas, seeing the vulnerability in his son's eyes. "Lucas, no. God, no," Richard said, his voice choked with emotion. "It was never, ever because of you. I was young and scared, and I made a terrible mistake. But it was my mistake, not yours. You are perfect, and I'm so sorry I made you doubt that for even a second." Tears welled up in Lucas's eyes. "But if you loved us, why did you go?" Richard felt his own eyes stinging. Sometimes adults make really stupid decisions, even when they love someone. "I thought I was doing what was best, but I was wrong, so terribly wrong. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you and your mom." Lucas was quiet for a moment, processing Richard's words. Then, hesitantly, he leaned against Richard's side. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. "I'm glad you came back," Lucas whispered. Richard carefully put his arm around his son's shoulders, his heart swelling with a love so fierce it was almost painful. "Me too, buddy. Me too." As they sat there, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, Richard knew that the road ahead would be long and challenging. Trust would need to be rebuilt, wounds would need time to heal. But in that moment, with his son by his side, Richard felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he could find redemption. Little did he know that fate had more twists in store, and that the delicate balance they were building was about to be tested in ways none of them could have anticipated. One frosty morning, Richard stood outside Emma's bookstore, a thick envelope clutched in his gloved hand. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation ahead, and pushed open the door. The familiar chime of the bell announced his arrival. Emma looked up from behind the counter, her expression guarded but no longer openly hostile. "Richard," she acknowledged with a nod. "Lucas is upstairs doing his homework." Richard shook his head. "Actually, I came to talk to you, Emma. Do you have a moment?" Curiosity flickered across Emma's face. She gestured towards a quiet corner of the store, away from the few browsing customers. As they sat down, Richard placed the envelope on the table between them. Emma eyed it warily. "What's this about, Richard?" He took a deep breath. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. About the past, about the future, about what really matters." Emma's brow furrowed. And I've realized that all the success, all the money in the world, it means nothing compared to what I left behind." Richard's voice cracked slightly. "I want to make things right, Emma. Not just with words, but with actions." He slid the envelope towards her. Emma hesitated before opening it, her eyes widening as she scanned its contents. "Richard, this is a lot of money." He nodded. "It's a trust fund for Lucas, for his education, his future." And he paused, steeling himself. "There's more. I want to help you with the bookstore. Expand it, renovate, whatever you need." Emma's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. "We don't need your charity, Richard. We've managed just fine without your money for 10 years. "It's not charity," Richard insisted. It's an attempt to make up for lost time. To give Lucas the opportunities one should have been providing all along." Emma's voice was tight with emotion. "Money can't buy back the years you missed, Richard. It can't erase the nights I spent wondering how I was going to make ends meet. Or the times Lucas cried because he didn't have a dad to take to Father-Son Day at school." Richard's face crumpled. "I know. God, Emma, I know. And I'll regret those choices for the rest of my life. But please let me do this. Not for you or for me, but for Lucas." A tense silence fell between them. Emma stared at the envelope, conflict clear on her face. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why now, Richard? Why this grand gesture?" Richard leaned forward, his eyes earnest. "Because I'm all in, Emma. I want to be here, fully present. For Lucas. For both of you, if you'll let me. I'm considering stepping back from my company. Spending more time here in New York." Emma's eyes widened in surprise. "You'd give up your empire? For us?" In a heartbeat, Richard said without hesitation. "I've realized what truly matters, Emma. And it's not in boardrooms or balance sheets. It's here in this bookstore with our son." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes, a mix of emotions playing across her face. "Richard, Before she could finish, the bell chimed again. They both looked up to see Lucas entering the store, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Dad?" Lucas said, surprise and joy evident in his voice. "I didn't know you were coming today." Richard's heart swelled at being called Dad. It was still new, still precious every time he heard it. As Lucas bounded over, Emma quickly wiped her eyes and managed a smile. "Your dad and I were just talking, sweetie, about some changes that might be coming." Lucas looked between them, curiosity piqued. "What kind of changes?" Richard and Emma exchanged a look, years of hurt and mistrust battling with the tentative hope of a new beginning. "Big ones, buddy," Richard said softly. "Really big ones." As Lucas settled in between them, eager to hear more, the air in the bookstore crackled with possibility. The future stretched out before them, uncertain but full of potential. Richard knew that the road ahead would be challenging, that trust would need to be rebuilt day by day. But looking at Emma and Lucas, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the sense of finally being home. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Richard arrived at the store to find Lucas hunched over the counter, his face scrunched in concentration as he pored over a thick textbook. "Hey, buddy," Richard called out, ruffling Lucas's hair affectionately. "What's got you so focused?" Lucas looked up, his eyes bright with excitement despite the frustration evident on his face. "Dad, I'm working on my science fair project. It's about renewable energy, but I'm stuck on some of the calculations." Richard's heart swelled at being called Dad. It still felt new, precious. He peered over Lucas's shoulder at the complex equations. Mind if I take a look? I used to be pretty good at this stuff. As they worked through the problems together, Emma emerged from the back room, a stack of books in her arms. She paused, taking in the scene before her father and son, heads bent together, lost in a world of numbers and theories. Well, this is a sight I never thought I'd see, Emma said, her voice a mixture of amusement and something deeper, more complex. Richard looked up, catching her eye. For a moment, the years seemed to fall away, and he saw a glimpse of the young woman he'd fallen in love with so long ago. "Mom!" Lucas exclaimed, breaking the moment. "Dad's helping me with my project. Did you know he built a solar-powered car in college?" Emma raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing at her lips. "No, I didn't know that. Your father was full of surprises back then." The word was hung in the air, laden with unspoken meaning. Richard cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the tightrope they were all walking. "Hey, Lucas," he said, an idea forming. "What do you say we take this project to the next level? I've got some contacts in the renewable energy sector. Maybe we could arrange a tour of a solar farm for your research." Lucas's eyes lit up. "Really? That would be amazing." Richard glanced at Emma, seeking her approval. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "That sounds like a great idea. As long as I can come too." The bell above the door chimed, and a customer walked in. Emma moved to help them, leaving Richard and Lucas to their project. As they worked, Richard couldn't help but marvel at his son's intelligence and curiosity. He felt a pang of regret for all the moments he'd missed, but it was overshadowed by a deep sense of gratitude for this second chance. Later, as the store was closing up, Richard helped Emma with the last of the tidying. Lucas had gone upstairs to call his best friend about their project breakthrough. "Thank you," Emma said softly, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "For today. For being here for him." Richard paused, a book halfway to its shelf. "Emma, But before he could finish, Emma's phone rang. Her brow furrowed as she checked the caller ID. "It's the school," she said, a note of concern in her voice. She answered, her face growing more worried with each passing second. "Yes, I understand. We'll be right there." As she hung up, Richard felt a knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. "What is it? What's wrong?" Emma's voice was tight with worry. "It's Lucas. There's been an incident at school. We need to go. Now." As they called for Lucas and rushed out of the store, Richard felt a surge of protectiveness he'd never experienced before. Whatever was happening, he knew one thing for certain. He would do anything to keep his son safe. Little did they know that this incident was just the beginning of a series of events that would test their fragile family unit to its very core, forcing them to confront not just their past, but the uncertain future that lay ahead. "Mr. and Mrs. Lawson," the principal began, then hesitated, glancing at Richard. "Montgomery," Richard supplied, his voice tight with concern. "I'm Lucas's father." The principal nodded, her brow furrowing slightly at the complicated family dynamic. "Right. Well, I've called you here because there's been a serious incident involving Lucas." Emma reached out, gripping Lucas's hand. "What happened?" The principal sighed. "Lucas was involved in a physical altercation with another student. Normally, this would result in immediate suspension. But given Lucas's otherwise spotless record, we wanted to discuss this with you first." Richard leaned forward, his protective instincts flaring. "Lucas, buddy, what happened? This doesn't sound like you at all." Lucas looked up, his eyes brimming with tears. He said I was lying. About you, Dad." A heavy silence fell over the room. Emma's grip on Lucas's hand tightened, while Richard felt as if the air had been knocked out of him. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Emma asked gently. Lucas's voice trembled as he spoke. "Jake said I was making it up, that I didn't really have a dad, that you were just some rich guy pretending. He said you'd leave again, that you didn't really care about us." Richard felt a surge of emotions, anger at the bully, guilt for putting Lucas in this position, and a fierce, overwhelming love for his son. "Oh, Lucas," Richard breathed, fighting back tears of his own. The principal cleared her throat. While we understand the provocation, violence is never the answer. We take bullying very seriously, and Jake will face consequences for his actions as well. But Lucas, you need to understand that resorting to physical violence is not acceptable. Emma nodded, her face a mix of concern and disappointment. She's right, Lucas. You should have told a teacher or come to us. Lucas hung his head. I'm sorry. I got so angry. I didn't want anyone thinking Dad didn't love us. Richard felt his heart breaking. He knelt in front of Lucas, gently tilting his son's chin up to meet his gaze. Lucas, listen to me. What happened in the past? That was my mistake. My terrible, unforgivable mistake. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. No matter what anyone says, no matter what happens, I love you and your mom more than anything in this world. Tears spilled down Lucas's cheeks as he threw his arms around Richard's neck. I love you too, Dad. Emma watched the exchange, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. The principal, visibly moved, cleared her throat. Given the circumstances, we'll settle this with detention rather than suspension. But Lucas, this can't happen again. Understood? Lucas nodded solemnly. Yes, ma'am. Promise. As they left the office, Richard's mind raced. He knew that his past actions had put Lucas in this vulnerable position, and he was determined to make it right. Emma, he said as they walked to the car, I think it's time I made a public statement. About us, about the past. I don't want Lucas to ever feel ashamed or have to defend our family again. Emma looked at him, surprise and a flicker of something else, hope, perhaps in her eyes. Are you sure? It would mean fully committing to this life, to you and Lucas, Richard finished. And I've never been more sure of anything. As they drove home, a heavy silence filled the car, each of them lost in thought about the implications of Richard's decision. For Lucas, it was a promise of stability he'd always craved. For Emma, it was a step towards healing old wounds. And for Richard, it was the final bridge between his old life and the one he now knew he couldn't live without. Little did they know that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would not only test their family bond but also bring unexpected challenges from Richard's past, threatening to unravel everything they had worked so hard to build. Richard stood backstage, his heart pounding. Emma and Lucas were beside him, a united front in the face of what was to come. Are you sure about this? Emma asked softly, concern etched on her face. Richard nodded, his resolve firm. More sure than I've ever been about anything. Lucas squeezed his father's hand. We're with you, Dad. Taking a deep breath, Richard stepped out onto the stage, the flashing of cameras momentarily blinding him. As he approached the podium, he caught sight of familiar faces in the crowd, board members, business partners, people who had been part of his life for the past decade. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to concern. Good afternoon, Richard began, his voice steady despite his nerves. I've called this press conference to make an announcement about the future of Montgomery Industries, but more importantly, about my own future. A hush fell over the room as Richard paused, gathering his thoughts. For years, I've dedicated my life to building this company, to creating an empire. But in doing so, I lost sight of what truly matters. 10 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I walked away from my family, from my partner, Emma, and our unborn son, Lucas. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Richard could see the shock on the faces of his colleagues, the furious scribbling of journalists. I've spent the past few months reconnecting with them, trying to make amends for my absence. And in doing so, I've realized where my priorities truly lie. Richard's voice grew stronger, more passionate. Effective immediately, I am stepping down as CEO of Montgomery Industries. I will retain a position on the board, but my focus will be where it should have been all along, on my family. The room erupted in a cacophony of questions and exclamations. Richard held up his hand, silencing the crowd. I know this comes as a shock to many of you, but I hope you can understand that this decision is not made lightly. It's made with the clarity of someone who has been given a second chance at what really matters in life. As Richard concluded his speech, introducing his interim replacement, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. But that relief was short-lived as he caught sight of a familiar face in the back of the room, Claire, his former assistant, her expression a mix of hurt and anger. Later, as they left the conference center, Claire approached them, her eyes fixed on Richard. "So this is why you've been so distracted," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "All those late nights, the secret phone calls. I thought we had something, Richard." Emma's head snapped towards Richard, her eyes widening in shock. Lucas looked between the adults, confusion evident on his young face. Richard felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. "Claire, it's not what you think. We can talk about this later, in private." But Claire wasn't finished. "No, I think your family deserves to know the truth. About us. About the real reason you've been spending so much time in New York." As Claire's words hung in the air, Richard saw the hurt and betrayal blooming in Emma's eyes, the confusion and disappointment in Lucas's face. In that moment, he realized that his past wasn't just something he could leave behind. It was a shadow that threatened to engulf the fragile new life he was trying to build. The world seemed to spin around them, the aftermath of the press conference fading into background noise as this new, unexpected drama unfolded. Richard knew that the next few moments would be crucial, that everything he had worked to rebuild could crumble in an instant. With his heart in his throat, Richard faced the three people before him, the family he was desperate to keep and the woman who represented the life he was trying to leave behind. The tension was palpable, the future uncertain, as they stood on the precipice of a revelation that could change everything. "Emma, please," Richard began, his voice cracking with desperation. "It's not what you think." But Emma cut him off, her words sharp as ice. "Not what I think? Then what exactly is it, Richard? Another lie? Another betrayal?" Claire stood to the side, her expression a mix of vindication and regret. "He's been lying to both of us, hasn't he?" she said softly, looking at Emma. Richard felt the world closing in around him. He knew that his next words could make or break everything he'd been fighting for. "No," he said firmly, looking directly at Emma. "I haven't been lying. Claire and we had a relationship. In the past. Before I came back to New York. Before I realized what I truly wanted, what I needed in my life." Emma's laugh was bitter. "And you didn't think this was something you should have mentioned? All those times you talked about honesty, about rebuilding trust." Lucas, who had been silent until now, spoke up, his voice small and trembling. "Dad, what's going on? Are you leaving us again?" The pain in his son's voice was like a knife to Richard's heart. He knelt down, looking Lucas in the eye. "No, buddy, never again. You and your mom are my world now. My only world." He stood up, facing Claire. "I'm sorry, Claire. I should have been clearer with you. What we had, it was a mistake. A way to fill the void in my life. But it's over. It has been since the moment I saw Emma and Lucas again." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "So I was just a placeholder? Something to pass the time until you decided to play family man again." Richard's face crumpled with guilt. "That's not fair. You knew I was damaged, that I was running from my past. I never promised you more than I could give." Emma, who had been watching this exchange with growing anger, suddenly grabbed Lucas's hand. "We're leaving. Now." Panic surged through Richard. "Emma, wait. Please let me explain." But Emma was already walking away, Lucas in tow. She paused only to look back at Richard, her eyes filled with a pain that went beyond anger. "You know, Richard, I actually believed you this time. I thought you'd changed. But you're still the same selfish man who walked out on us 10 years ago." As Emma and Lucas disappeared into the crowd, Richard felt as if his world was crumbling around him. Claire stood there for a moment longer, her own hurt and anger palpable. "I hope it was worth it, Richard," she said quietly before turning and walking away. Left alone in the aftermath of his press conference, surrounded by curious onlookers and persistent reporters, Richard felt the full weight of his past mistakes crashing down on him. He had thought he was on the path to redemption, to rebuilding the family he had abandoned. But now, in a cruel twist of fate, he found himself more alone than ever. As he watched the retreating figures of Emma and Lucas, Richard knew that he was at a crossroads. Everything he had worked for, every step forward he had taken in rebuilding his relationship with his son and rekindling the trust with Emma, was now hanging by a thread. The question that loomed large in his mind, that seemed to echo in the very air around him, was stark and terrifying. Had he just lost his family for the second time? And if so, was there any way to win them back, to prove that his love and commitment were real despite his mistakes? With a heavy heart and a mind racing with desperate plans, Richard set off after Emma and Lucas, knowing that what he did next could determine the course of all their lives forever. As he rounded the corner to Emma's parents' house, his last hope, Richard saw a light on in the upstairs window. Relief flooded through him, quickly followed by a wave of anxiety. He approached the door, his hand hesitating before he finally summoned the courage to knock. The door opened to reveal Emma's father, John, his face a mask of barely contained anger. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here, Richard." Richard's voice was raw with emotion. "Please, John, I need to talk to Emma. To explain." "Explain what?" John's voice was cold. "How you abandoned my daughter and grandson once, and now you're doing it again?" "No, it's not like that. Please just let me." But John cut him off. "They don't want to see you, Richard. Go home." As John began to close the door, Richard heard a small voice from inside the house. "Grandpa? Is that Dad?" Lucas appeared behind John, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. The sight of his son's pain-stricken face broke something inside Richard. "Lucas," Richard choked out. "Buddy, I'm so sorry. Can we talk? Please?" John looked torn, glancing between Richard and his grandson. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he stepped aside. 5 minutes. That's all you get." Richard entered the house, acutely aware of the hostility radiating from John. Emma was nowhere to be seen, but Lucas stood in the living room, looking small and vulnerable. Kneeling down to Lucas's level, Richard spoke softly. "Lucas, I know you're confused and hurt, but I need you to understand something. What happened with Claire? It was in the past. Before I came back to you and your mom. It doesn't change how I feel about you both." Lucas's lower lip trembled. "But Mom said," she said, "you lied again. That you're still the same person who left us." Richard felt each word like a knife to his heart. "Your mom is hurting right now, and I understand why. But Lucas, I swear to you, I am not the same man who left. That man was scared and selfish. I'm here now, fighting for you, for us as a family. I love you more than anything in this world." Tears spilled down Lucas's cheeks. "You promise you won't leave again?" "I promise," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "No matter what happens, I will always be here for you. Always." Lucas hesitated for a moment before throwing his arms around Richard's neck. As Richard held his son close, he heard a soft gasp from the doorway. He looked up to see Emma standing there, her face a storm of conflicting emotions. "Emma," Richard breathed, standing up slowly. "Please, can we talk?" Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this again, Richard. The trust, the hope. It hurts too much when it all comes crashing down." Richard took a tentative step forward. "I know I've made mistakes, terrible, unforgivable mistakes. But Emma, everything I've done since coming back, stepping down from my company, trying to be a father to Lucas, it's all been real. You and Lucas are my world now. Please, give me one more chance to prove it to you." The room fell silent, the only sound the patter of rain against the windows. Emma looked at Lucas, still clinging to Richard, then back at Richard's pleading face. The air was thick with tension as everyone waited for Emma's response. In that moment, as Richard stood there, his heart laid bare, he knew that whatever Emma decided would shape the rest of their lives. The path to redemption was never easy, but he was ready to walk it, no matter how difficult, if it meant keeping his family together. As Emma opened her mouth to speak, the weight of their shared history and the possibility of their future hung in the balance, leaving them all on the edge of a decision that would change everything. "I want to believe you, Richard. God knows I do. But how can I trust that this time is different? Richard stepped forward, his heart pounding. Because this time I know what I have to lose. Emma, these past few months with you and Lucas, they've shown me what really matters in life. I was a fool before, running away from the best thing that ever happened to me. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Lucas looked up at his mother, his eyes pleading. Mom, please, can't we give Dad another chance? Emma's resolve wavered at the sight of her son's hopeful face. She turned to her father, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of concern and skepticism. Dad, what do you think? Emma asked, her voice trembling. John sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. Sweetheart, I can't make this decision for you, but I will say this, people can change. It's whether you're willing to risk your heart again that matters. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, as if steeling herself for what was to come. When she opened them, there was a determination in her gaze that Richard hadn't seen before. Okay, she said softly. Okay, Richard, but this is it. This is the last chance. If you hurt us again, if you lie or keep secrets, that's it. We're done. Do you understand? Relief washed over Richard like a tidal wave. He nodded vigorously, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. I understand. I swear to you, Emma, I will spend every day proving to you and Lucas that you can trust me. Lucas's face lit up with joy, and he hugged his father tightly. Does this mean we can be a real family now? Emma managed a small smile, though her eyes still held a hint of caution. We're going to try, sweetie, but it's going to take time and work from all of us. Richard nodded, his voice thick with emotion. Whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, anything. I'll do it all. As the family embraced, the tension in the room slowly began to dissipate. John watched from the doorway, his expression softening slightly. Well, he said gruffly, I suppose we should have some dinner. It's getting late, and it looks like we have a lot to talk about. As they moved towards the kitchen, Richard felt a glimmer of hope he hadn't dared to feel before. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, that trust would need to be rebuilt brick by brick. But looking at Emma and Lucas, he felt a sense of purpose and belonging he'd never experienced in all his years of corporate success. Later that night, as they prepared to leave, Emma pulled Richard aside. Her voice was low, serious. Richard, I meant what I said. This is the last chance. I need you to be completely honest with me about everything. No more secrets, no more surprises. Can you do that? Richard met her gaze, his eyes filled with sincerity and determination. I can and I will. Emma, I promise you, from this moment on, my life is an open book to you and Lucas. No more hiding, no more running. I'm all in. As they stepped out into the night, the rain had stopped, and a few stars peeked through the clearing clouds. Felt like a sign, a new beginning. But as they walked towards their uncertain future, none of them could have predicted the challenges that lay ahead, challenges that would test their newfound commitment in ways they never imagined. The journey of rebuilding their family had only just begun, and the path forward was fraught with obstacles. But for now, as they walked hand in hand, there was hope, fragile and tentative, but hope nonetheless. The question that hung in the air, unspoken but felt by all, was whether this hope would be enough to weather the storms that were yet to come. One crisp autumn evening, as the leaves turned golden outside the bookstore window, Emma found Richard lost in thought, staring at an old photograph he discovered while organizing. What's that? She asked, her voice softly curious. Richard startled slightly, then handed her the picture. It showed a much younger Emma and Richard, laughing together on a beach. Do you remember this day? He asked, his voice tinged with nostalgia and regret. Emma's fingers traced the edges of the photo, her eyes misting over. Our first vacation together. Coney Island. You were so carefree then, so different. Richard nodded, his throat tight. I was happy, truly happy. I just didn't realize it at the time. A heavy silence fell between them, filled with unspoken words and shared memories. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. What changed, Richard? Why did you leave us? Richard took a deep breath, knowing this moment of honesty was crucial. I got scared, Emma. Terrified, really. The idea of being responsible for a child, of potentially failing as a father. It paralyzed me. So I ran. I threw myself into work, convinced myself that success and money were what mattered. But I was wrong. So incredibly wrong. Emma's eyes searched his face, looking for any trace of the man who had abandoned her all those years ago. And now? Are you still scared? Richard met her gaze, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Every day. But now I'm more scared of losing you and Lucas than I am of failing. I know I can't change the past, Emma, but I swear to you, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it. Just then, the bell above the door chimed, and Lucas burst in, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Mom, Dad, guess what? I got the lead in the school play. The tension of the moment broke as both Emma and Richard turned to their son, genuine smiles lighting up their faces. That's amazing, buddy, Richard exclaimed, pulling Lucas into a hug. What's the play? As Lucas launched into an excited explanation about the upcoming production of Peter Pan, Emma watched the interaction with a mixture of joy and lingering apprehension. The scene before her was everything she had ever wanted for her son, for their family. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts. Could Richard truly have changed this much? Was this happiness built on a foundation strong enough to last? Later that night, after Lucas had gone to bed, Emma found Richard on the small balcony of their apartment, gazing out at the city lights. Penny for your thoughts? She asked, joining him. Richard turned to her, his expression serious. Emma, I've been thinking. I want to make this official. I want us to be a real family, in every sense of the word. Emma's heart skipped a beat. What are you saying, Richard? He took her hand in his touch gentle but sure. I'm saying, I want to marry you, Emma. If you'll have me, I want to do this right, to give Lucas the family he deserves, to give us the life we should have had all along. The world seemed to stand still as Emma processed his words. A whirlwind of emotions swept through her: hope, fear, love, and lingering doubt. She looked into Richard's eyes, searching for any sign of hesitation or insincerity. But all she saw was love, pure and unwavering. As she opened her mouth to respond, the weight of their shared history and the possibility of their future hung in the balance. Whatever her answer, both knew that this moment would define the course of their lives forever. The city hummed around them, oblivious to the drama unfolding on one small balcony. But for Emma and Richard, the entire world had narrowed to this single moment, this pivotal decision that could either seal their family's fate or open the door to a future they had both dreamed of but never dared to hope for. Richard, I don't know what to say. Richard's grip on her hand tightened slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. I know it's sudden, and I know we still have a lot to work through. But Emma, these past few months have shown me what truly matters in life. You and Lucas are my world, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you both. Emma's mind whirled with conflicting emotions. The love she felt for Richard was undeniable, but the scars from the past still lingered. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. What about your company? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Your life in Shanghai? Are you really ready to give all that up? Richard's response was immediate and firm. I already have. Emma, none of that means anything without you and Lucas. I've learned that the hard way. The company, the money, the success. It's all hollow if I don't have my family. Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she listened to his words. She wanted so desperately to believe him, to throw caution to the wind and embrace this chance at happiness. But the fear of being hurt again held her back. I'm scared, Richard, she admitted, her voice barely audible. What if this doesn't work out? What about Lucas? Richard gently cupped her face in his hands, his touch warm and reassuring. I'm scared too, Emma, but I'm more scared of losing you both again. We've been through so much, overcome so many obstacles. I believe in us, in our family, and I promise you, I will spend every day of my life making sure you and Lucas never doubt my love and commitment again. Just then, A small voice interrupted their moment. "Mom? Dad? What's going on?" They turned to see Lucas standing in the doorway, rubbing his sleepy eyes. The sight of their son, looking so young and vulnerable, seemed to crystallize something in Emma's mind. She looked back at Richard, seeing the love and hope shining in his eyes. In that moment, she made her decision. "Yes," she whispered, a smile breaking through her tears. "Yes, Richard. I'll marry you." Richard's face lit up with joy, and he pulled Emma into a tight embrace. Lucas, now fully awake, rushed over to join them. "What's happening?" he asked excitedly. "Are we really going to be a real family now?" Emma knelt down to Lucas's level, her heart full of love for her son. "We already are a real family, sweetheart. But yes, your dad and I are getting married. Is that okay with you?" Lucas's face broke into a wide grin. "Are you kidding? It's more than okay. It's amazing." As the three of them hugged on the balcony, laughing and crying at the same time, Emma felt a sense of peace wash over her. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, that rebuilding trust and forging a new life together wouldn't be easy. But in that moment, surrounded by the love of her family, she felt hope for the future stronger than ever before. Little did they know that their newfound happiness would soon be tested in ways they never could have imagined. As they celebrated their engagement, forces were already in motion that would threaten to tear their family apart once again. The sound of a phone ringing inside the apartment broke through their joyous moment. It was Richard's business line, a number that hadn't rung in months. As he reluctantly went to answer it, Emma felt a chill run down her spine, an inexplicable sense that their perfect moment was about to shatter. The journey ahead would be fraught with unexpected twists and turns, testing the strength of their love and the bonds of their family. But for now, in this fleeting moment of pure happiness, they held on to each other, savoring the joy of their reunion and the promise of a future together. "This is Richard," he said, his voice suddenly tense. Emma and Lucas watched, their smiles fading as Richard's expression grew more serious with each passing second. "I understand. Yes, I'll be there as soon as possible," Richard said finally, ending the call. He turned to face Emma and Lucas, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Richard, what's wrong?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard ran a hand through his hair, his eyes meeting Emma's with a mixture of regret and determination. "That was the board. There's been a crisis at the company, a major security breach. They need me in Shanghai immediately." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, threatening to rain on their newfound happiness. Lucas's eyes widened with fear. "But Dad, you can't go. You just promised we'd be a family." Richard knelt down to Lucas's level, his voice gentle but firm. "Buddy, I'm not leaving for good. This is just a temporary thing. I have to go and fix this problem, but I'll be back as soon as I can." Emma stood frozen, her mind racing. This was exactly what she had feared, the past coming back to haunt them, threatening to tear apart the fragile foundation they had built. "How long?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Richard stood up, reaching for Emma's hand. "A week, maybe 2 at most. I swear." "Emma, this doesn't change anything. I meant every word I said. You and Lucas are my priority." Emma wanted to believe him, but doubt crept in like a cold draft. "Richard, we've been here before. Your work always seemed to come first." "Not this time," Richard interrupted, his voice firm. "I'm going because I have to protect the livelihoods of thousands of employees. But I'm coming back. To you, to Lucas, to our life here. Nothing is more important to me than that." Lucas looked between his parents, his young face etched with worry. "Promise you'll come back. Dad, you won't leave us again." Richard's heart broke at the fear in his son's voice. He pulled both Emma and Lucas into a tight embrace. "I promise. With every fiber of my being, I promise I'm coming back. This is just a bump in the road, not an ending." As they stood there, holding each other tightly, Emma felt a whirlwind of emotions. She wanted to trust Richard, to believe that this time would be different. But the scars from the past ran deep, and the fear of being abandoned again clawed at her heart. "When do you leave?" she asked softly. Richard sighed. First flight out tomorrow morning. I'll pack quickly and be back before you know it. As they began to prepare for Richard's sudden departure, the mood in the apartment shifted. The joy of their engagement was overshadowed by uncertainty and apprehension. Emma busied herself helping Richard pack, her mind racing with unanswered questions and fears. Later that night, as Lucas finally fell asleep,